Okay, so with the timing main offset, that angle just describes the angle difference between the true top dead center cylinder 1 firing position and the position where this crank trigger pattern starts, which should be pretty much in the vicinity of top dead center cylinder 1 firing, but there is the ability to tweak it a little bit. So I prepared a bit of a picture in paint, and you can see here the big yellow line is the actual top dead center cylinder 1 firing position. The small yellow line is the actual origin of this crank trigger pattern. In this case, it's 20 degrees. That's why the 20 degrees is entered in that timing main offset. So just jumping back to MapMate. Okay, so we can see on the scope a wasted spark system where the ignition is fired once every crank rotation of the engine. So I'd just like to demonstrate now how you go about changing to a 720 degree system. So either you'd like to run sequential injection or direct fire ignition. And the setting here that's relevant is this sync phase repeats, as I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and change that to sequential. And the other thing you need to do, let's concentrate on the ignition, for example, is you need to visit the ignition settings. You need to turn the wasted spark off and change these ignition sequences from a wasted to a sequential setup, like so. Okay, so if we go back to the scope, you can see nothing's actually happened yet. We're still in wasted spark mode. The reason being that these settings are set up at power on. So what we need to do now is save the calibration. I'm going to disconnect the USB. I'm doing a power cycle, reconnecting my USB. Okay, so now if we go back to the oscilloscope, you can see that we're running 720 degrees ignition system, that is direct fire. Just zoom in there. And yeah, hopefully you can see that the ignition edge is at the correct advance, which I believe is around 30 degrees under these conditions. Okay, so that's probably a pretty brief rundown of how we can tweak the settings with this 60-2 crank sensor arrangement. So let's go ahead now and consider that we'd like to set up some other crank sensor arrangement, say from a file. So I'm going to disconnect the USB just to make things simpler and open up a calibration file. For example, let's choose an old school engine, an Opel C18E, which is 4-cylinder engine from the 1980s, and it runs a Hall effect sensor within the distributor. So that's a very simple crank pattern. It's not actually a crank pattern. It's, I guess you could call it a cam sensor because it's coming off the camshaft, but we're going to treat it as a crank angle sensor for this example. So you can see that a few of these settings are a little bit different. We're running off any edge instead of a rising or a falling edge. We turn the VO enable off because now we're using a Hall effect sensor. We're continuing to use 360 degree system since we don't have a cam sensor. So the sync phase repeats is in batch still. And because this is not a multi-tooth trigger arrangement, we can't run ignition tooth timing. So I've disabled that there.